You know, when you're dedicated to self-improvement like you are, you're always on the lookout for those mental traps that can hold you back.
Right.
Well, today's deep dive is about one of the sneakiest ones out there,
Uh-oh.
something called survivorship bias.
It really is fascinating how this bias can affect even the sharpest minds.
I know, the first time I heard about it, I was like, wait,
Yeah.
what? I've been making decisions based on incomplete information.
Yeah.
It's a real aha moment. So for our listeners who might be encountering this term for the first time, can you break down exactly what survivorship bias is?
Absolutely. In essence, survivorship bias is this tendency to focus on the things or people who have survived a process while completely overlooking those who didn't. Imagine only looking at the soldiers who returned from a war. You'd get a very distorted view of what the war was actually like, right?
Okay, that's a powerful image.
Yeah.
So basically, we're only seeing the winners and not the countless others who tried and maybe didn't succeed. I can see how that would lead to some seriously flawed conclusions about success.
Exactly. We might mistakenly think certain strategies or traits guarantee success when it was actually just chance or a whole host of factors we're not even aware of.
Okay, so it's like looking at the tip of the iceberg and assuming that's all there is.
A perfect analogy, and the danger here is that it can lead to overly optimistic beliefs and bad decisions. We might overestimate our own chances of success or misjudge the true risks involved.
You know, this whole concept reminds me of something I read about early research into ESP. It involved a guy named Joseph Banks Rhine and his experiments with these special cards called Zener cards.
Ah, yes. Ryan's work is a classic example of how survivorship bias can creep even into scientific research, especially when dealing with something as intriguing as psychic phenomena.
So tell me more about that. What happened in his experiments?
Well, Ryan claimed to have found evidence of ESP by testing subjects on their ability to guess what was on the Zener cards. Some subjects seemed to perform way above chance, which initially made it seem like they were picking up on something extrasensory.
Okay, so I can see why people were excited about that.
Absolutely, but here's the catch. Ryan didn't fully account for all the subjects who failed his tests. He focused on the survivors, the ones who guessed correctly, which skewed the results.
So had he included the data from everyone, including those who guessed poorly, the results might not have looked so impressive. It's like he cherry-picked the data that supported his hypothesis.
Precisely, and this isn't just an issue with ESP research, it can happen in all sorts of fields. Think about the world of scientific research itself. Have you ever come across the term publication bias?
Hmm, doesn't ring a bell.
It basically describes how studies with positive or exciting results are more likely to get published. Meanwhile, studies with negative or inconclusive results are often left unpublished. So when we're reading scientific literature, we're mostly seeing the winners and not the full picture.
That's a good point. It's like judging a restaurant based only on its five-star reviews without considering all the people who might have had a less than stellar experience.
Exactly. And there's a very influential 2005 paper titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, which really highlights how pervasive this issue can be.
Wow, that title is pretty provocative. I'm starting to see just how widespread this whole survivorship bias thing is.
It truly is everywhere, even in seemingly harmless areas like those studies that claim Oscar winners live longer.
Wait, really? Winning an Oscar adds years to your life? That's wild. What's the catch here?
It's actually a great example of another type of survivorship bias called immortal time bias. In this case, the immortal time is the period between when an actor starts their career and when they potentially win an Oscar.
So it's like saying people who graduate college live longer without considering that, well, you have to survive long enough to graduate in the first place.
Exactly. In the Oscar study, researchers didn't fully account for that crucial fact. You have to be alive to win an Oscar. This led to an inflated estimate of how much longer Oscar winners actually live.
It sounds like we have to be really careful about drawing conclusions from data without considering the full picture.
Yeah.
So are there any other areas where this bias pops up that our listeners should be aware of?
Oh, tons. Let's think about finance. Mutual fund performance can look misleadingly good if you only consider the funds that are still operating. The failures have dropped out of the data. We also see it all the time in business.
Where we hear about the success stories of entrepreneurs, but not the countless startups that failed along the way.
Right. It creates this illusion that entrepreneurial success is more common than it actually is, and this extends to history, where we study organizations that are still around, not the ones that fizzled out and left no trace.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's like
Yeah.
the world is constantly editing itself, showing us the highlights and hiding all the bloopers.
And that can be especially dangerous when it comes to our own decision making, leading us to make choices based on incomplete or even misleading information.
So what can we do about it? How do we learn to see past this highlight reel and get a more realistic view?
Well, one of the most powerful examples of how to combat this bias comes from a fascinating story. During World War II, it involves a statistician named Abraham Wald and his work with the U.S. military. During the war, the U.S. military was losing a lot of bombers to enemy fire. They wanted to figure out where to add armor to improve the plane's survival rate. So they brought in Wald to analyze the damage patterns on the bombers that returned from missions.
So I'm guessing they were looking at where the planes had the most bullet holes and thinking, okay, let's reinforce those areas.
That's what most people would assume, but Wald had a completely different and frankly brilliant insight.
I'm intrigued. What did he see that everyone else was missing?
He realized they were focusing on the wrong data. They were looking at the planes that survived, the ones that made it back to base. But what about the planes that were shot down? Those held the real key to where the armor was needed most.
Wait, so instead of looking at where the returning planes were damaged, he focused on where they were unscathed. That seems counterintuitive.
It is, but that's the genius of it. Wald understood that if the returning planes had bullet holes in certain areas, it meant those areas could take damage and the plane could still fly.
So the areas where there were no bullet holes on the returning planes were likely the areas that, if hit, would bring the plane down.
Exactly. He flipped the problem on its head and searched for the missing data. The data from the planes that didn't survive. By doing so, he identified the most vulnerable areas that needed reinforcement.
That's incredible. By thinking about what was missing, he saved countless lives. It really highlights how powerful it can be to beyond the obvious and consider the full spectrum of possibilities.
Absolutely. And I think there's a big lesson here for those of us on the path of self-improvement.
Okay, I'm all ears. How does this apply to our own journeys?
Well, how often do we focus only on the success stories we read about people who achieved their goals and assume their path was straightforward without considering the obstacles they likely faced, the setbacks they overcame? We might even start to believe that if we just follow their steps, success is guaranteed.
That makes a lot of sense. So what you're saying is, to avoid this trap, we need to actively seek out the missing data in our own lives, the stories of those who struggled the paths that didn't lead to the desired outcome.
Precisely. We need to look beyond the highlight reels and ask ourselves, what are the potential pitfalls? What are the challenges others faced, even if they didn't survive? To tell the tale, what can I learn from those experiences?
That's a really powerful shift in perspective. It's almost like we need to become investigators of our own goals and aspirations.
I love that it's about being more discerning, more critical, more realistic in our assessments. It's about acknowledging that success often involves a lot of trial and error detours and even dead ends.
So if survivorship bias can make success seem easier or more attainable than it really is, what are some practical things we can do to counteract this bias in our own lives, especially when it comes to self-improvement?
One of the most effective things you can do is cultivate a habit of seeking out diverse perspectives. Don't just consume information from sources that confirm your existing beliefs or only highlight the positive.
So diversify my reading list, follow people with different viewpoints on social media, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Expose yourself to a wider range of voices and experiences. Talk to people who've tried different approaches, even if they didn't achieve the outcome they were hoping for. Their insights might surprise you.
It's like getting the behind-the-scenes footage, not just the polished final product.
Right. And remember, it's not about agreeing with everything you hear. It's about challenging your assumptions, expanding your understanding, and developing a more nuanced and realistic view of the world.
I'm starting to realize that this whole idea of seeking out diverse perspectives ties in beautifully with what we're doing with this deep dive. We're exploring survivorship bias from different angles, looking at research stories and real-world applications.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners. Engage with information actively. Don't just passively consume success stories, question, analyze, and seek out the missing pieces.
It's about becoming more informed and empowered decision makers, right? Not just in our personal lives, but in all aspects of life.
Could have said it better myself. We need to remember that every story, every piece of data represents just one perspective, one sliver of a much larger reality.
Okay, so we've talked about being aware of the bias, seeking out missing data, diversifying our perspectives. Anything else we should keep in mind?
I think it's crucial to remember the role of chance and timing in any success story. When we only focus on the winners, we tend to overestimate the influence of talent, hard work, or specific strategies.
So we forget that sometimes, despite our best efforts, things just don't work out. And other times we might get lucky breaks that propel us forward.
Precisely. And ignoring the role of chance can lead to a lot of unnecessary self-blame when things don't go our way.
This conversation has been so insightful. Is there anything else our listeners can do to become more aware of survivorship bias in their own lives? How can they start applying this knowledge to make more informed decisions, especially when it comes to their self-improvement goals?
That's where a shift in focus can be really helpful. Instead of fixating solely on the outcome, the achievement, try focusing more on the process itself.
That's interesting. Do you elaborate on that?
When we get caught up in the end goal, we often overlook the journey, all the steps it took to get there. We forget about the hard work, the setbacks, the lessons learned along the way.
So you're saying that by fixating on the end result, we might actually make success feel more out of reach?
Exactly. We start comparing ourselves to these idealized versions of success without seeing the full picture, and that can be incredibly discouraging.
It's like focusing on the perfectly framed Instagram photo without seeing the 99 outtakes that didn't make the cut.
I love that analogy. Success is rarely a straight line. It's usually a winding path with twists and turns, maybe even a few dead ends along the way.
So embracing the journey becomes really important then.
Absolutely. It's about finding joy in the process, celebrating the small victories, and even learning from the setbacks.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about shifting our mindset from, I need to achieve X to be successful, to I'm going to enjoy the process of learning and growing, regardless of the outcome.
Precisely. And that can be incredibly empowering because you're no longer defining your worth by a single achievement. You're valuing the journey itself, the person you're becoming along the way.
I'm also thinking about how this applies to dealing with setbacks. If we focus too much on the survivors, we might start to believe that successful people never fail.
That's a common misconception, and it can be really damaging. We need to remember that failure is an essential part of growth. It's how we iterate, how we adapt, how we become more resilient.
So maybe instead of fearing failure, we should embrace it as a learning opportunity, as a chance to course correct and figure out what works better next time.
Exactly. There's that great saying, every master was once a disaster.
Okay, so let's bring it all together for our listeners. Survivorship bias is this sneaky mental trap that can distort our view of success, risk, and even reality itself. But by becoming aware of this bias, by actively seeking out missing data, by diversifying our perspectives, and by focusing on the process, not just the outcome, we can make more informed decisions in all areas of our lives.
Beautifully summarized. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: approach the world with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to challenge your own assumptions.
It's about acknowledging that there are multiple paths to success, that setbacks are inevitable, and that the journey is just as important as the destination.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into survivorship bias. Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration and self-discovery. We hope you've gained some valuable insights that will help you navigate your own path with more awareness, wisdom, and resilience. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the complexities of the world around us.